Near the very end of Christ's mortal ministry, he prophesied about the destruction of Jerusalem. He was asked by his apostles when it would take place, and his answer is recorded in Matthew 24. Verse 15 and 16 says, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judæa flee into the mountains." I personally believe that we need to better understand this prophecy as it was highlighted by Christ himself to best understand the last days' signs of the times. The prophecy comes from Daniel in the Old Testament. Yes, this is the same Daniel that interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream and was later thrown into the lion's den. In several places in the book of Daniel, he speaks of the abomination that maketh desolate. This is a small part of a broader prophecy known as the 70 weeks prophecy, which I discussed in another video. Historically, Daniel 11:31 is often linked to the actions of Antiochus IV in 167 BC, who desecrated the Second Temple by setting up an altar to Zeus and sacrificed a pig on it. This is where the idea that the abomination of desolation is a desecration of the temple, so severe that the sacrifice and daily oblations end for some time. The final quote-unquote week of that 70 weeks prophecy is a period of 7 years, which is known as the tribulation. I also did another video on this period and the prophecies that will happen during this time. Daniel speaks of this week by saying, quote, "And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate." The event that happens in the middle of the 7-year tribulation period is the abomination of desolation. This event separates the final 7-year period before Christ's return into 2 3.5-year periods. Christ spoke about the abomination of desolation twice in Matthew 24. The first time he talks about it, he is referring to the Roman conquest which happened in 70 AD. 3.5 years prior to the temple being desecrated on August 10th, 70 AD, the Jewish revolt began. 3.5 years after the temple was desecrated, Masada was finally taken. I believe this to be the first fulfillment of Daniel's abomination of desolation prophecy. But Christ mentioned Daniel's prophecy again, speaking of the last days, saying, "And again shall the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, be fulfilled." Many places in Scripture, especially in Daniel and the book of Revelation, it speaks of a 3.5-year period just prior to Christ's return. To be clear, this isn't the second coming, but rather his appearance when he saves the Jews from Armageddon. This 3.5-year period is spoken of a bit cryptically, as it is sometimes called times and half a time, other times 40 and 2 months, and sometimes 1,260 days. Most of the really bad judgments that are inflicted upon the world happen during this time, and they are all kicked off when the abomination of desolation happens. According to Christian tradition, the Antichrist is a powerful and influential person who makes a covenant with Israel near the beginning of the tribulation and then breaks it and is personally responsible for the desecration of the Jerusalem temple when the daily sacrifice ends. He also makes war with Israel, and the battle is known as Armageddon, which happens over that remaining 3.5-year period, called the Great Tribulation. This is where the two witnesses in Jerusalem emerge and protect Israel through powerful plagues being unleashed on the invading army. I'll pause here because when I spoke of the Antichrist before, I mentioned it is a Christian tradition. LDS belief is not so specific in defining the Antichrist as a man, although it could be, but it may be a group, an organization, a government, or even a coalition. But let's talk about what the abomination of desolation is itself. Something so abominable that there is a desolation. The abomination is the desecration of the temple itself. Then some people interpret the desolation as the destruction that comes after. Some believe it is the judgments of God that come upon men as a result of wickedness. I think those are both true, but my reading leads me to an additional interpretation of the term desolation. Christ in Matthew 24 calls it an abomination of desolation, but Daniel himself calls it the abomination that maketh desolate. What is made desolate? The fact that temple worship ceases for a time makes me believe that the desolation is a period where God or God's Spirit ceases to dwell at that place for a time. A spiritually desolate place, an abomination that makes it spiritually desolate for some time. In many ways, the abomination of desolation that happened in 70 AD kicked off the great apostasy where God's authority wasn't on the earth. And when the abomination of desolation happens in the last days, it ends with major destruction, which kicks off the half hour of silence in the heavens. Could that mean a period of time before Revelation resumes? As I think about various prophecies, I try to think if they are literal, symbolic, or spiritual. But this is a prophecy that I feel we can really take literal, because it happened literally in history before. So I feel we can safely assume it will happen literally again in the future. There are some that say that rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem could be spiritual or symbolic. But if the abomination of desolation is literal, then a third temple in Jerusalem needs to also be literal. Therefore, the abomination of desolation can only come about once the Jerusalem temple is built. And for the record, I agree with Bruce R. McConkie in his book, The Millennial Messiah, that the third temple will be built by the Jews and not by us. Then, after the abomination of desolation and also after the end of the tribulation, that is when Christ saves the Jews. This is the moment when they look upon him, see the wounds in his hands and feet, and Christ says, "These are the wounds with which I was wounded in the house of my friends." It is at this moment that the Jews realize he is Jesus Christ, the one whom they crucified in the meridian of time. This is the moment when the Jews accept the gospel of Jesus Christ. This is the moment that ends the time of the Gentiles and begins the time of the Jews. This is when the Jerusalem temple can be rebuilt again. Perhaps we will call this the fourth temple, depending upon the level of destruction that the temple receives during Armageddon. And this time it will be built as a temple that can perform authorized ordinances. Then sometime after the half hour of silence has concluded, and keep in mind we have no idea how long that will actually be, then Christ will return in glory. This will be his second coming, when the righteous will be lifted up, which many Christians call rapture, and the wicked are burned. This is when the morning of the first resurrection begins, and the graves of the righteous will be opened. I hope that gives you a better understanding of the specific prophecy known as the abomination of desolation, what it means, and when it will happen. Thanks for watching.